hopefully the Bible this morning will be able to inspire in each one of us faith, hope, love, and humility. We got a big crowd, next door with our young families and our kids. They've got a back-to-school party. Afterwards, we've got a growing number of people that are joining our services every Sunday that are out of town or out of state. And if you're streaming in this morning, we love you. Great to have you with us, and hopefully we'll be able to see you in person soon. Let's open up our Bibles to the book of Luke. The book of Luke to chapter 4. Next week, we're starting up our New to North River series again. Please take note of that in the newsletter. If you've moved into town in the last several months and started attending our services, if you're considering about transferring in from a sister congregation, if you're just a friend and a guest of ours from the community and you're interested in knowing more about this church, not just coming occasionally from time to time, but really being a true brother, sister, member, part of the functioning body of Christ. We'd love for you to be a part of that, and yet we want to explain exactly what we mean by that, and hopefully we'll all be on that same page and be able to worship and serve together with one heart and one mind like the scriptures talk about. So next week, it begins. During the sermon, all of you, again, that have been moved into town recently and haven't been recognized as members yet, will be meeting during the sermon over at the FLC and have 3 consecutive sessions, 3 consecutive weeks. All right, let's look in Luke chapter 4. I'd like to start reading and to tie in to what Jeff talked about last week in verse 24. Jesus is going to refer back to the prophets, and he's going to refer back to that time that we studied last week in the ministry of Elisha. And if you remember in chapter 4 in 2 Kings, we'll go there in a moment. In chapter 4, Elisha is able, by the power of God and the persistent faith of a Shunammite woman, to cause something to happen beyond what anyone could ask or imagine. There was some asking, but even beyond what was asked, God was able to move. And God works like that, but he works like that not all the time. It's dependent in so many cases on our faith, on our heart, on our humility, and honestly, on our asking. And here's how Jesus refers to this, because in chapter 5, we're going to continue on in 2 Kings. We're going to see Elisha again after he's healed the Shunammite woman's son. I mean, even more than healed, if you know what I'm talking about. We're here last week in a reading in a miraculous way. Now we're moving on to another setting where a Syrian commander-in-chief named Naaman also experiences the same kind of wonder, power, and amazing act and working of God. But here's how Jesus refers to it, because he throws in a little line about this in Luke chapter 4 that gives us a bit of context. Okay, here we go. Luke chapter 4, beginning in verse 24. I tell you the truth, no prophet is accepted in his own hometown. And the context, he's going back to his hometown, Nazareth, and he's preached, but people are not rolling with it. They're not accepting it. They're not responding in humility and faith. They're responding with, now, who is this guy and why is he doing this? And I'm not sure if I buy this. They're skeptical, and so no miracles are done in his hometown at that time, but he refers back to a time that we'll read about in a moment, and he talks about Elijah in the next verse, and then he gets into Elisha in verse 26, or verse 27. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet. Yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. What was it about Naaman the Syrian that although God can do anything at any time, there's only one person in that entire period of time who was healed of leprosy, and we're going to read about that in 2 Kings chapter 5. Let's turn over there. Okay, we're basically continuing on from where Jeff ended last week, okay, in the ministry of Elisha. Beginning in chapter 5 and in verse 1. So follow along with me. We're gonna learn a lot about the power of God, but we're also going to learn a lot about us and what kind of heart we need to be able to activate it in verse 1, chapter 5. Now Naaman, 2 Kings. That's right after 1 Kings, if you need a hint, all right? 2 Kings, chapter 5, verse 1. Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. That's Syria. And as we know, even today, in that part of the country, it just has a history of being war-torn. And it was at that time, it still is today. But there's this commander of the armies of Syria. And it says, he was a great man in the sight of his master and highly respected, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. This is really an interesting word. Depending on your translation, it's also translated man of valor. This phrase in the Bible is attributed to David as a man of valor, mighty man of valor. To Gideon, do you remember, in Judges? Oh, Gideon, you mighty man of valor. To Jephthah. The only time this word in the Bible refers to a Gentile, or a pagan as they would say it, is with this man, Naaman. He was a man of valor. He was highly respected. He was honorable, depending on what your translation is. I think we've already figured it out. The only people in the world who are honorable and men and women of valor and character are not just Christians. There are people who aren't Christians, who have a great character, who have a good heart, who actually, if they just knew what was right, would be even more embracing of it, maybe than me and you. But they just haven't been exposed to it yet. They haven't heard about it yet. And so here's a man, it's in the same kind of spirit as Cornelius. Remember him in the ministry of Jesus? Or in the book of Acts, okay? The Gentile. He had a good heart. He was seeking for God. Or the centurion in the ministry of Jesus, where Jesus says, I haven't seen this kind of faith in all of Israel and all of my people. But these are people outside of the covenant of God, and yet they had the right heart. They had the right character, and God was going to work to lead them to him. It's good to be able to note that, and it's also good and humbling for us to realize, there are a lot of great people in the world that aren't members of our church or even Christians yet. I love to say yet, don't you? Because you're hoping that good character and humility will lead someone to really a saving relationship with God through Jesus Christ in response to his grace. He had everything going for him. You couldn't get any higher up in your career than being the head of all the armies of the nation at that time that was at the top of the heap. He had all kind of the trappings of success and honor, material things and pride and prestige and honor and celebrity, but he had something else, didn't he? He had leprosy. Leprosy, we don't get leprosy so much this day and age because it's able to be it's not epidemic status and is able to be addressed and medically in a way it wasn't back then. But leprosy started out with these little red spots. Actually for us, sometimes you get these little red spots and bumps, right? And you go, ugh. What is that? You don't want it to be a sore to grow into something else that could be more ominous. Well, it was very ominous back then. You start getting these little red bumps. And then it starts getting to be sores, and then your hair starts falling out. First happens to a lot of us without leprosy. But first on your head, but then your eyebrows go, and they're gone. And then your fingernails start getting rough, and your toenails, and they fall off. And then finally your joints, start becoming affected, and they start swelling up, and they're cracking and peeling off, and little by little the digits start falling off. And basically your whole life, it's wasting away, and you will die, and it will be a horrible death, not just the pain, but the absolute, in that day, being separated. It was contagious. You just had to be off by yourself or with another leper or two. And it was a horrible, situation. You waste away. That's what Naaman's facing. Now, let's keep on reading. Now, in the lands of Aram, verse 2, they had gone out and they'd taken captive a young girl from Israel. and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Now, we're referring to Elisha, the prophet. This is interesting too. Here's a young woman. We don't know if she's 16 or 26, but she's been taken into captivity. That was very common back then. You'd be conquered, and the conquering nation would take some of the best and the brightest, okay, and they'd bring you in, and you'd be slaves, for them. At the time of the Roman Empire, it's estimated that half the people in the Roman Empire were slaves in some form or another. And this girl, when you're in slavery, it's not too awesome, okay, and yet you're able to see the mysterious working of God, through a very tough situation, and it will remind you of some other people that were in slavery, right? Or sold into slavery, and yet God used them to help even change the course of history, as well as individual lives. Anybody remember Joseph? Sold into slavery. That was a bad day. That was a bad few years. That was rough. And as a believer trying to figure out, what is God doing? This is crazy. Similar to what Jeff was tying into last week, right, with the Shumanite woman, as she lost her son. What is going on? I thought this was supposed to be the abundant life, and you're sold into slavery, and yet God's plan for Joseph was to tremendously bless his life and the life of other people, but it was a little rough there for a little bit, but he responded in how? Faith, character, and as a person of valor. You remember Esther? She was taken captive, and God used her in a tremendous way, even as a slave in that empire. Anybody remember Daniel being deported? Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, as they were changed to their Babylonian names, and yet God used them in a great way. It is not uncommon for God's people to go through some rough situations, because like that song we sang, it really isn't about me and you, it's about God. We're like, we're passing through, we have different roles that we play, but ultimately we're going to be with him for eternity. It's going to be amazing. But there's certain assignments that we have in this life, and they're all not particularly savory at the moment. And yet God used this servant girl, this young girl, to be able to say, there is a prophet. There is a man of God, in Israel, in Samaria specifically, who can do something about this. Now, Naaman's wife, I'm sure she was desperate. That was kind of a strange thing to think that there'd be any possibility. But she responds, and the story really starts interesting, right now. I think if you've had the privilege of being raised in a Christian family and around real disciples, and you know the scriptures and you know the truth, you're going to be called on to make a real impact from time to time in your life. You got the daily stuff that we do in serving people, reaching out to people, but God's given us some knowledge to be able at very key points in people's lives, and maybe even in the history of a country or a community, to be able to make an impact when we speak up. And when we take what God has given us and be able to offer to other people, let's see what happens, okay? Naaman went to his master in verse 4 and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I'll send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him, this is amazing, this is a ton of money, $1.2 million in today's currency. And so he takes off with all of this gold, the 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 talents of silver and festive clothing. And the letter he sent the king of Israel read, "With this letter I'm sending my servant Naaman to you, so you may cure him of this uncurable disease," leprosy. As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and he said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of leprosy?" See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me? I mean, it's kind of like, let's say a mob boss gets an emissary from Don Corleone, from a fellow mob boss, but this mob boss is a little bit weaker. and he sends his number 2 guy, okay, along with $1 million, and says, here you go, Dom Francisco, or what's his name? Here's $1 million. Cure this guy of pancreatic cancer or AIDS and send him back next weekend. And the guy's going, dude, I'm toast. Okay, he's picking a fight with me. This is not possible. And it's actually kind of a humorous scene if you really want to take a look at it. Not funny to the king. He's tearing his clothes off. Let's see what happens next. In verse 8, Elisha comes to the rescue. Elijah, the man of God, heard the king of Israel had torn his robes, and he sent him this message. Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he'll know there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots, and they stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Now Elisha sent a message to him saying, hey, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed. Now, that's a great offer, but something has to happen here first. It's interesting, isn't it, that the king of Syria figured the king of Israel had a relationship with a strong man of God and was spiritual. He just assumed that, but that wasn't the case. And it's so interesting, I think, for all of us, just because we're in proximity to some great spiritual people doesn't mean we get it or even take advantage of it. Just because we were raised in a really strong, committed family and our families were strong disciples. Maybe they became disciples like in their youth 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and they've raised, you to just love God and to come to church and be committed and believe in the power of God, but it's just not working for you. You're not getting it. Or you're in a dynamic church. Just because you're a member of a dynamic church doesn't mean you got a dynamic walk with God. Or you're even spending time around the stronger disciples that you have access to, but you may not be taking advantage of it all. Or just because we talk a good game spiritually doesn't mean we're really connected to the really strong men and women of character and faith that can really help change our lives and change the lives of the people with their problems as they come to us. And they need some solutions. That's just very interesting when you think about this. But this is here's what happens now. Naaman has gone to the right place, hasn't he? Now he's gone to Elisha. He's gone to the right place, and he's gone to the right person. It may be that this morning you and I have come to the right place. It may even be that we're really spending time with the right people who can help us get to where we really need and want to be in our walk with God, in our marriage, in our parenting, in our character, in our whole spiritual life. But you got to do more than just be in the right place. You have to have the right heart. Because according to Jesus, there was only one in the whole generation who was healed of leprosy. And so they not only got the right place and the right person, Naaman had to get the right heart. And he's going to be tested here in just a moment. We know about what that heart is from the rest of the Bible. There's so many passages. But I don't know that you can get a better one than in Matthew chapter 18, where when Jesus is asked, who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And it says Jesus took a little child, small child, set them in front of them, and he said, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you, unless you repent and change and become like this little child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Did that get your attention? So you know something about the person sitting next to you, right? Okay? What has to be in your friend next to you in their life for them to get to heaven? You have to become like a little child, and he says in verse 4, to be humble like a little child. It's so many places in the Bible. 1 Peter chapter 5 tells us that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. James chapter 4 says the very same thing. Jesus Christ himself, it says, learned obedience by what he suffered. And in Philippians 2, the passage that we read this morning, it said, even though he was God, he humbled himself. Jesus humbled himself and became obedient unto death on the cross. Even Jesus. Even Jesus. This quality of humility, this is going to have to be big time a characteristic of my life and your life to ultimately get to heaven where we want to go. But I honestly believe, I think when you consider it, you'll agree, to really have a great marriage, to really have a great character, certainly a decent even walk with God, it's got to begin by being humble, being willing to listen and to learn. Naaman starts out not in the best of frames of mind. Okay, let's read. Chapter 5. All right. Elisha in verse 10 sent a messenger to him and said, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you'll be cleansed. But Naaman said in verse 11, it said, he went away angry, and he said, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over that spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Just like Elijah did on that Mount Carmel, because I'm a big shot. This man's not even coming out to say hi to me. He's sending some Gehazi, some minion to come to me and tell me to go jump in the water. And Naaman was what? He was mad. He was angry. Would you say there was a Scotia pride there? A little bit of ego there. Well, you can understand it. I mean, that's how he had been cultured, okay? But he's going to have a decision. Am I going to humble out and listen to people around me? Or am I going to stay in this prideful, angry state and stay with leprosy? Or could I have a chance and really getting turned around in my life? Look what happens. Look what happens next. Then here's how he goes on and he talks. He says, are not the Abana and Pharpar, those are some nice rivers in Syria, the rivers of Damascus better than any of these silly waters in Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? And so it goes on. He turned away and went in a what? In a rage, all right? He's getting even madder, all right? Then Naaman's servants went to him and he said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? How much more then when he tells you, go wash and be cleansed? So we went down. Now, the thing he doesn't say, he listened, right? He listened to advice of minions. Follow what I'm saying? Not of big shots, his superiors. He listened to people who were under him, who were not responding so pridefully and a little more logically. Is it true that people who are younger than you, less experienced than you, maybe less spiritual on the whole or experience, can have greater insight than you can have at the moment? And especially when you are mad, furious. Of all times, that's the time to listen to people. You ever get mad? You ever get furious? I love Sherwin. I got to lead the Bible talk that he was in a few years ago. Long time ago, and help him actually become a disciple. But Sherwin, he really helps me. I generally only get mad at electronics, right? And I can get furious at electronics, can't I? It happened Thursday, didn't it? Right at the beginning of our D time. Now, Sherwin is a mature man of character, and he knows me. He didn't even have to say anything, but he looked at me a certain way. And I eventually listened. And I had a better lunch. Parents, you ever get mad or furious? Do you listen to your spouse when you get mad and angry? You got to listen to your children sometimes when you get mad and angry. We can get in a huff, right? It just is the way, even if we're a man of character and noble. But when you get angry, and there's a history that goes all the way back to Cain and Abel on this one, you got to slow down and listen. Like God said to Cain, hey, sin is crouching at the door. You got to master it. Hey, be super careful when you get angry and mad and when you get furious, especially when a strong Christian tells you something. They're not trying to make your life miserable. And so here's a beautiful thing. Guess what? Naaman listens, first of all, to his minions, those younger than him, and then he decides to listen to the man of God. Amen to that. Because Naaman has to do the same thing all of us have to do. He has got to get humble. The other thing that you're going to find out right now that you're going to see, Naaman has to get humble, then he also has to be humble enough to do exactly what God says. Not roughly what God says, not generally what God says, but exactly what God says. And when he does it that way, then God can work and be more than just religious or have a nice spiritual pilgrimage and get a little input, and maybe a little salve, on your wounds. But there can be transformation when you are humble and listen. James chapter 1, verse 19, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry or defensive. Look what happens. This is so awesome. Okay? It says, Naaman's servants went and told him, if the prophet had told you some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? Much more than when he tells you, wash and be clean. So in verse 11, so he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Is that not awesome? He did exactly what God said. What was his first inclination after getting mad and ticked off? He said, okay, if I'm going to go get baptized or I'm going to get, dunked 7 times, where am I going? I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to go find a better river that I like, that makes sense to me. I'm going to do it. What do you think if he'd gone down, Naaman, and he'd head back to Syria, and he went down and plunged 7 times in this other river? What do you think would happen? I don't know. He didn't do it. You can speculate. I speculate nada. Nothing. He's going to get mad at somebody else now. How about if he went to the Jordan River and he dipped down once, twice, 3 times, and then I'm channeling the 70s, or 80s back there. 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, and then he just kind of said, it's plenty. What do you think? What do you think when Jesus said to the blind guy, and he spat, and he put it on his eyes and said, go wash in the pool of Siloam, and you will be healed? What do you think if the guy said, that's a long way, I'm going to stop at the water fountain? Is this not what we do a lot? We kind of sort of do what God says. We're generally in the ballpark of what God says. But we are not really humble enough with all of our heart and mind and soul and strength, with whatever knowledge or insight and counsel that we have from older, more mature disciples, or even younger, at times. We're not doing everything we know God says. And we're shocked that they're not these great results. Like following 75% of a recipe or something, and you're like, wow, that didn't turn out so good. It's just Naaman was humble enough to listen. How are we doing? Listen, and not just to a Bible, but also the spiritual people in his life. Humble enough to listen, and humble enough, like Jesus, to do exactly what God said. And was it a great end to this story? More amazing than what anybody could have imagined. We're celebrating a special anniversary. Any of you guys get baptized in the month of August? I know KY did. Okay, I just saw him. Okay. And Jonathan did. I love that passage. It says, when it says about Naaman, got in the water, it's actually the word plunged himself, kind of like Jonathan did last week. Remember, he kind of almost baptized himself. He was like jumping in there, if you remember the baptism last week. There was just this intensity and this enthusiasm to go get it done once you really come to a point of decision. There's a special anniversary that took place 5 years ago yesterday. A gentleman named Scotty Spencer was baptized 5 years ago. Scotty's a very special man. He contracted 16 years ago Lou Gehrig's disease, that a lot of you know is a neuromuscular degenerative disease that basically, you normally in 3 to 5 years, it takes your life. This was 14 years ago. He had the good fortune of meeting 17 years ago one of our brothers in the church here, Mike Brown. Mike, are you here? Okay, Mike Brown here somewhere. Okay, could you stand up? This is Mike, and this is a hero, okay, to many of us. We love you, bro, faithful brother. But for 17 years, Mike has been reaching out to Scotty and reaching out to him. And 5 years ago, through the influence of Mike, the Word of God, especially his wife, Donna, he was baptized. He can't be with us in our service. He watches over the internet. How you doing, Scotty? And but he is going to share some things through his testimonial here for us. Here's a man who at 64 years old, with some real challenges and some real challenges in his faith, decided ultimately to do exactly what God told him to do, and continues to be an inspiration for us. So, Scotty, please share your heart with us here.
9 years ago, my wife Donna brought Mike Brown into my life. Mike is a wonderful person. He's done so much for us, and he started my journey to baptism. And being no stranger to confrontation, I had no trouble arguing with him. And sometimes I really frustrated him. And there were times we thought about chunking the whole idea and just stopping the Bible study. Well, many of you all have certain scriptures that when you've read it or it's explained to it, the light bulb goes off. And that becomes the meaning of Christ to you. The same thing happened to me. God expects very little out of you if you don't know very much about Him and everything and haven't studied Him. But the more that you study about Him and everything, the more He expects out of you. Well, that set off my light bulb, because I'd realized that for the past 62 years, I had been down in that no little section, and God really didn't expect much out of me. But now that I was studying the Bible and learning about Him and everything, I said, He's expecting a whole lot more out of me. And one of those things is He expects me to get baptized by immersion. So the next time the Bible study group met, I said, guys, before we start, I got something to say. Well, I could see this look on their face of, where's he going now? Well, I told them, guys, I want to be baptized. Dead silence, blank stare on their face. And then out of the corner, Mike Brown said, I've been waiting for over 8 years for you to say that. Well, about 12 days before I was to be baptized, Mike and my wife took me to a doctor's appointment, routine situation. Well, We got there, they parked in the parking lot. They went to get me out of the van, and I was non-responsive. Donna slapped me, pinched my arm. She even twisted my nipples. No response. She said, Mike, we got to get him to the ER. Well, 4 hours later, I woke up and started talking. And the nurses were yelling, he's awake, he's awake. And he's talking. Nobody could understand why or anything. And the only thing we could think of was God was not going to let me not be baptized. We had everything set up for it to occur at 1 o'clock after church services. Well, my son-in-law and caregiver had put me in this wheelchair, wheeled me out, put me on the elevator that would lower me down to get in the van. Son-in-law pushed the button. Nothing happened. Checked out some things, pushed it again. Nothing happened. We put in the call to the church, said, we got a problem. Mike let the people know there'd be a slight delay. He pointed out 6 big guys and said, we got to go. We got a problem at Scott's house. Well, while we were waiting, I was talking to my son-in-law and all, and I said, you know what? I think it was Satan that made that elevator malfunction. It was his last chance to keep me from being baptized. Well, the cavalry showed up. They asked me if I wanted to delay the baptism. I said, no way. So they just picked up this wheelchair with me in it, carried it down the steps, put me in the van, and off we went. The guys picked me up out of this chair, laid me on a blackboard that they were going to use. Well, as they were transferring me, the first thought I had was of the movie scene of the fallen warrior being placed on his shield to put on the funeral pile so that his spirit would be cleansed by fire. And then I said, no. In my case, what they're doing is they're putting this broken, sin-racked body to the board to raise me up, and I'll be slid into the water to be purified and released of sin. Well, there must have been a spotlight directly over the baptismal, because when Glenn and Mike immersed me, I opened my eyes and time kind of stood still. I was surrounded by this light, and I had this feeling of shedding a weight, but also being infused with this euphoric feeling of peace and well-being. When I surfaced, the witnesses there said I had the biggest smile on my face they had ever seen. After most of my new brothers and sisters had come down to welcome me into the flock and everything, this mother and daughter approached. Well, the young lady said that she was so moved by the baptism, and the same hand she was afraid that she was going to miss it, because after church she had gone up the hill to a youth meeting, and she was looking at her watch to start. 1 o'clock came and went. It was 10 after 1 when she was able to get out. She power walked down to the church, came in, and was relieved to see that the service had not started. Well, this really moved me that a young person like that wanted to see this sick old man get baptized. And then the thought hit me, and I told her, you know, I don't think it was Satan that made that elevator malfunction. I think it was God. I think he was testing my commitment one more time, but he was also providing the opportunity for you to be there. With that, both our eyes swelled up with tears and everything. And I thought, I didn't mean to make you cry. And then it hit me. And went in my mind, you know, in a very small way, I had seen not only the power of God, he had revealed the reason why he had done what he had done. So please remember, never underestimate the power of the Lord in your prayers. It's never too late, and never give up when you're trying to bring a person to the Lord and salvation. That's it.
Jesus.
Amen. I want to turn around and look up at the camera and say, happy birthday, Scotty. Happy birthday, Scotty. 5 years old in the Lord and going strong. And, you know, Scotty may get to his ultimate destination a little bit quicker than the rest of us, but we're all heading the same direction. And we get there with humility, and we get there by whatever the obstacle, internally, externally, doing exactly what God tells us to do. Please continue and read on this week the rest of chapter 5. You're going to see, just like Scotty, a very enthusiastic young believer. I mean, when Naaman is cleansed, first of all, he wants to give all this money to Elisha, and Elisha says, no, I don't need the money. Then he packs up 2 mules worth of soil to take back to his own home, because they was very superstitious, you know, at that time. If you took some of the land, you were able to worship God. And Elisha says, that's fine, go ahead and take the dirt. And then and then he said, and then he's all concerned because he says, you know, I want to worship with all my heart, but when I'm with the king and he's bowing down before this God who I'm not going to believe is a God anymore, could you just put in a good word for me with God? You know, I mean, that's basically what he says. And Elisha says, go in peace, you know, and trusting that this man with a beautiful heart, like the Ethiopian and like Cornelius and like the centurion, this man of valor had really come to true faith in God. That's pretty inspiring, isn't it? Let's dig into the Word, dig into the Scriptures. Keep reading, keep looking, and seeing all the things that God has to teach all of us. And then as you finish reading, please be alert to the last part of that chapter, because there also is a twist that's very sad, is Gehazi, okay, the servant, decided to be deceitful and love money and greed more than integrity. And so you see in the culmination of that chapter, a pagan with leprosy who with faith is healed. And then we see a believer who because of greed and deceit receives leprosy. And so just sitting here in this church building and just believing in Jesus Christ, you know, our hearts can go in a bad direction. And let's just stay humble and stay obedient. And guess what? We're going to see the power of God